for sticking around after a previous very exciting panel. Hopefully this one's even better. So I'm Nadim Hossain. I'm the CEO and co-founder of BrightFunnel. And real quick about myself so you know where I'm coming from. So I was a former CMO, and the challenge I had as a CMO was figuring out what worked and what didn't. So I started a company to do B2B marketing attribution. So very much in the spirit of trying to figure out how to apply ML to marketing. And our panel is even more esteemed by a long shot. So I want each of them to introduce themselves really quickly, and then we'll get going. And why don't we start with you, Harpy?
Sure. So my name is Harpy. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Slice. We are a data and analytics company. We have a large panel of users, and we provide insights to leading brands, both CPG and non-CPG, around what people buy online, and we use machine learning in a variety of ways, so we'll get into that.
Great, thanks.
My name is Jessica Cross. I'm head of customer lifecycle marketing for AdRoll. AdRoll is a marketing platform that allows customers to serve up advertising across web, social, email, across cross-channel. I also used to report to Nadim when he was CMO, and he and I struggled with attribution.
True. No embarrassing stories, please.
Hey, this is Abhishek Pani. I work at Adobe, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with a bunch of Adobe products. I'll talk a little bit about the digital marketing piece of Adobe. It's a $2 billion business for us. We run analytics, content management, ad tech, and social listening for large enterprises. So my role at Adobe is twofold, building products in the ad tech, MarTech space using AI machine learning, and I also run data science for our Creative Cloud Document Cloud business, which is a $5 billion SaaS business.
Good afternoon. My name is John Bara. I'm President and Chief Marketing Officer of Mintigo. It's great to be here at TiEcon 17 and to return to Santa Clara. I started my career here 27 years ago in Santa Clara at a small semiconductor company down the road called Intel Corporation. And I worked with some great Indian entrepreneurs, including Vinod Dham, Atul Vijayakar, Avtar Saini, on the chip called the Pentium. So we had a great team. My company, Mintigo, does predictive analytics for B2B customers. Our large customers include Oracle and Red Hat and also Intel. And we help our marketers and sales executives at our customers find buyers faster.
Thank you, guys. And I actually want to share a story as well. Our BrightFunnel's very first angel round of funding actually had an investor from Thai Angels. So even our history from the last couple of years has a legacy intertwined with that of Thai. So we're really proud to represent here as well. So a couple of things I want you guys to note. I think they gave their bios, are very humble. What you have here on the panel, you've got B2B and B2C, MarTech and AdTech across the experiences. Functionally, you have engineering, you have CMO, head of lifecycle marketing, you have a CEO, and you have data science. And across them, there's a variety of experience. Obviously, I'm also a former CMO and currently a CEO. So as you think of questions or as you listen and think of what you want from this panel, there's a broad diversity. So with that said, I wanted to kick off with just very briefly, obviously the title of the panel worked, you're all here. But what are we actually going to talk about? So what is, when we say AI and ML, I think the title did mention both, what are we talking about? So let me define the terms very broadly. So the term AI, as you know from other sessions, is pretty broad. It's been around for a long time. The way I define it is just the general idea of machines behaving like humans, where you think it's actually a person. It doesn't require machine learning for AI to exist. You could have something that seems like AI, but is just a recommendation based on heuristics. So AI is very broad and very general. I think the use cases we'll talk about are mostly going to be ML. And that's obviously more of a specific application of actual data science techniques to data. So with that said, I just want to quickly poll the panel to see, and maybe this time we'll start with you, John, reverse it, to get anything else you wanted to add to the general topic of applying AI and ML to MarTech and AdTech.
Well, I think what you see in technology is a series of waves, right? And they usually last about 10 years, right? there was a great computing wave in the 90s that we all experienced and benefited from. We went through a wave of search and automation in the early 2000s. And I think now we're in the midst of a wave that I would really call the wave of intelligence. And so, you know, if you think about what has driven marketing and sales up to this point, it's often two different things. So marketing is all about leads, right? They want leads, they want names. They're almost like data hoarders, right? They never met a lead they didn't like. You know, even walking in here to get into this room, 3 people were scanning me. They wanted to get the badge and the name, even though I'm already in the system. But that's just how it is in marketing. Now sales doesn't give a shit about leads. They want buyers. Right? So you have a kind of a divergence from the beginning of this whole conversation between marketing and sales. And so I think what I would add to this conversation about AI and machine learning and marketing is it's now time for marketing to move from the era of hoarding data to the era of really refining the data, mining it, and providing more intelligence to the sales teams for success.
So the way I look at it, and I'm not sure what the right phrasing is, whether AI, ML, data science, it honestly doesn't matter. I mean, what we should look at is building scalable systems that learn from data, help us with understanding and decisioning, and do that in uncertain environments. Now, whether that is applied statistics, optimization, AI, machine learning, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's good that every few years we have a new phrase and there's enough money then flowing into the space that enough people are happy about it. But I feel end of the day, marketing, understand the adjacencies of marketing with other aspects of your business, and then use systems which can learn from data.
To your point, I think of the joke, what's the difference between a data scientist and a statistician? I think it only has to do with locale. You know, data scientists are here in Silicon Valley and statisticians are elsewhere in the United States. But to John's point, you talked about...
They also make a little bit more money.
Yeah, they make a lot more money, I think, when you put that label on it. But to your point about automation, I feel like we rode a wave of about a decade worth of automation. And to me, what AI and machine learning give me is the promise of an actual intelligence to that automation and those workflows. So when you combine predictive intelligence with automation, you actually come up with something much, much better. Ideally, to deliver to your customers the right message at the right time with the right intent. That's a big thing for me as a customer lifecycle manager. Mm-hmm.
So my first exposure to AI, I think many people in the room will resonate to, was 25 years ago when I was applying to grad school, sitting in India, and I knew that it was really easy to get a scholarship if you said that you were interested in AI. So when I was applying for the PhD program, that was in my application. So 25 years later, here we are. So I think AI, frankly, I think is somewhat, I would characterize it somewhat differently in that AI, I think, is positioned as clever algorithms. You know, certainly we have these algorithms that are enabled and so on, and I think that's true, but I think it's really more a data story. I think if you look at Facebook, Google, Tesla, the reason they're able to take advantage of AI versus, you know, some of the more upcoming companies is because they have amassed massive data sets. So I think AI is more about data. I think algorithms are enablers, but I think if you look at TensorFlow and all the algorithms that have been open sourced, I think that's going to get sort of leveled. It's going to be people who have the data sets and the marketers and the salespeople and the databases that have traditionally kind of captured these data sets. There's not been shortage of data sets in the past. I think there's been an explosion recently, but it's really activating those data sets now and people with the large data sets that are sort of poised to win here.
Yeah, well said. So, you know, just to recap, I think we've heard a couple of point of views. I don't think they're necessarily, we're not yet disagreeing, so we'll get into some of that, hopefully. But this idea that AI is about data, you know, Jessica made the point that it's really about the workflow and the automation, which in the previous session you heard Tehi make that as well. This idea of SaaS and intelligence combining. And John was talking about in the B2B use case, which I live every day, this idea that, you know, sales and marketing, you know, want different things. So, you know, building on Harpy's point, I wanted to echo that. Just kind of what I observe myself is the algorithms aren't the hard thing, and they might be different in B2B and B2C, and that's my next question I want to get to. But at least in B2B, the data is the hard thing, right? You have to have, people say proprietary access to data. Now, what is proprietary is another whole other conversation, but you have to have data, apply algorithms. What I would want to add to that, and what I want to ask you guys is, where does the user interface come in? What we were talking about earlier when we were prepping, what I see in the B2B world is often the UX does matter because it isn't a closed loop system. You've got to get a human to take some workflow action. So I'm curious for each of you guys, do you see, and my hypothesis is that the more it's a closed loop or B2C, the less it matters, but do you guys see that issue of the user interface is relevant to AI and recommendations and ML in general? Maybe we'll start on this end this time. Go ahead, Harpy.
So I think user interface, I think there's two ways I think about it. One is, does the question come before the answer, or does the answer come before the question? So what I mean by that is, traditionally, the way the analysts and the data analysts have worked is, you have a question in mind, you go chasing the data. And what that means is, by definition, you've cut off a lot of stuff that's in the data set which may not match your question. So I think one part of the interface is letting the data speak for itself. I think every data has shape, and a lot of times the tools kind of may not always allow the data to kind of project the shape. So I think we have to be careful about question before the answer or answer before the question. That's one part of it. Second, on the interfaces, I think there's no disagreement. I think the interface depends on what the use case is. So the interface could be an API. It could be a B2B interface or a B2C interface. So I'm not sure if other panelists have different views on it, but I think the interface is kind of what's the tool required for the job. There is no one right interface. I think it could be the API may be the right interface, and the B2C tagging algorithm for Facebook may be the right interface.
So I can think of two examples, one where an interface is very much necessary and another where the interface is not necessary, but more AI just powers better recommendations and the customer receives the end benefit. At AdRoll, we process more transactions, I think 2 times more transactions than the New York Stock Exchange does every single day in terms of our bids and cookies showing up on the web and people visiting different websites. So our machine learning algorithm has to know which customer they should serve which impression to at what time across what point in the web. And we let the algorithm handle that because that machine learning will do that far better than any human ever would. So none of that's actually really exposed to our customers. What they see on the end result is better click-through rates, better cost per mil, better ROI for their marketing channels. And that's really what they want at the end of the day, is they want advertising programs that just perform. How it happens, they don't really know, but they want it to perform. The other use case I can think of is actually similar to your company, Mintigo. We use predictive scoring for our sales and marketing teams to help us curate the large volume of inbound inquiries we get every single month. But it really is still upon the actual marketing and sales team to take action on those insights. So I can bubble up lots and lots of information from my sales team, and whether or not they actually take action, that's up to the human, which leads me to start to think about whether or not I actually want a sales team, but I think that's a different panel to talk about.
I have a slightly different take. I mean, interfaces do matter in 2 parts of the entire stack. One is just in data collection, right? If the problem we were discussing, if you look at salespeople, they don't enter a lot of data because they don't see any value to them entering that data. Now, if they don't enter the data, there's nothing much you can do on the data science front and make a bunch of claims, right? But the other part is, even in the B2C setting, maybe data collection is easier, but having the right interface makes a difference in where you collect the data. So you can collect data in a logged in state, in a logged out state. Now, you may not care about it initially, but when you think of something very fundamental to data science, which is identity of the user and your ability to stitch together a bunch of events across these different devices and channels to the user, having the right interface does matter. So I think people should spend enough time thinking about the interface and the trade-off of traffic condition on what kind of interface you define, because it does have significant implications on down the funnel value that you can add using data science and machine learning.
That's a very insightful response. The more questions you ask a customer, often the more customers or prospects will fall out of your UI. So you have to be very astute in how you design it to just ask for the right amount of data. Some of the younger people in the audience will appreciate this story and find it maybe amusing, but a good UI can really accelerate the whole business for a company. I'll give you an example. I was first a customer of Google around 2002 or 2003, and Google would send two very nice young people dressed in business suits to my office, and they would say, John, what keywords would you like to try this month? And they would write them on a legal pad, and they would go away, and they would come back about 30 days later and say, John, here are the results of your keyword search. I think we should move more money over here and less over here. No kidding. This is how it started. It was very manual. So then, roll the tape forward 5 years. In 2007, I was CMO of a company, and we were competing with VMware. We were a small startup called ZenSource that was ultimately acquired by Citrix right across the street here, another great Santa Clara company. And I became a beta user for Google AdWords, the new UI. And here I am, the CMO. I have a very small marketing team, and I can put in my own keywords. I sprinted to the CFO's office. I mean sprinted, and I said, Earl, give me a credit card with $50,000 limit a month. And he said, are you crazy? I said, I'll go to the board if I have to. That's how powerful that UI was for me as a CMO, because it gave me a force multiplier on the ability to tune my own ads, get real-time feedback, see the analytics, and beat my competitor. So that's an example of how a UI can really help. It's not the only way to get there, and I agree with you. It's a piece of the puzzle, but it can be a breakthrough if you get a great UI.
And you mentioned Google. It just reminded me that even Google has, at least they used to this is years ago, they have humans rate the search results, right? There is both an algorithm and also a checking to see, okay, what do humans think about it? Are you optimizing for the top 5 or the top 1? All that kind of stuff. I think there's a whole name for that field, and I'm not an expert in it. But even Google, tries to optimize the interface to figure out what's the right thing. And so I want to give some use cases, and maybe this question is a good transition into that. So when I was asking about the user interface, I want to give you guys a concrete example. So we do attribution, which is to say you've got 10, 20, 30 touches to land that 6-figure deal. We tell you what each touch is worth. What are the touches? What's the sequence? What is it worth? So that's the setup. What we found is there's the math. You run data. We have the data, as Harpy was saying. You run it through an algorithm. It comes up with an answer. But in our case, what I was trying to hint at is it still requires someone like Jessica or a CMO or a head of demand gen to take action on it. And so if they don't understand what the recommendation is, they're just going to reject it. And I think that's going to be a really exciting field that all of us are going to have to contribute to. And as a concrete example, there are things that aren't human readable, just an output from a ML model, or we have an interface where there's slider scale, and we're testing both. So I just think it's an area that, it's a very rich area for innovation that all of us are thinking about. So with that, I want to pivot into having each of you give, maybe starting with one use case. So we promised you guys 7. We hope to exceed that. Give us a specific use case of ML in your domain and how that, or AI if you want to call it AI. And why don't we start with Jessica? We'll start in the middle this time.
One use case of machine learning in my domain. So again, I'll just go back to predictive scoring. I've used it for many years now. I actually worked at 2 different predictive scoring companies. When you have such a large volume of prospects on your plate, I think a sales rep, they need curation, they need prioritization, they need to know where best to invest their time in terms of optimizing their cost to serve or cost to acquire. So predictive intelligence and predictive scoring really do a great job of curating our volume of inbound inquiries based on who has the highest likelihood of turning into a customer.
And just to kind of expand it for the audience, if you've got 10,000 people coming in, it tells you which
so if we
ones to
get
go after.
10,000 a week, we're not going to call all 10,000. We want to call the top 1,000 or the top 500. So, and those would ideally have the highest propensity to turn into a customer for us.
And the nice thing about that is, if you are wrong, no one's going to die, right? I mean, the consequences are unknowable, right? I mean, they're very hard
The
to know.
consequences are we leave money on the table. That's the big consequence. So that's where, again, we think through, you can provide up the recommendation for your sales team. Whether or not they take action, that's their own decision, and that's their own, honestly, job on the line.
Yeah. Go ahead, Abhishek.
Yep, that was a good comment. I mean, at least in marketing tech and ad tech, nobody is dying. I mean, that's a low bar, and I think we have built enough technology to be somewhat a little above that bar. So one of the areas where I feel machine learning has been very successful is in the entire ad tech space. So Rob will talk about Facebook ads after us, but if you look at Google, Facebook, and all, fundamentally they make their money through advertising, and it is very, very large-scale advertising. So I can give you the perspective from what an advertiser faces. Some of our clients, they bid on 50 to 100 million keywords on Google every day. So when you are bidding at that scale, collecting traffic on what it costs historically, how the consumers are responding to my ads, how they are purchasing on my website or the app, pulling all that data together, building predictive models to understand when you bid for a certain thing X, what is the response, both in terms of cost and revenues, and then taking the marketeer's budget and objective into account and solving a problem to come up with a bid every day and maybe multiple times in a day. That is an application of AI and machine learning which has been phenomenally successful over the last decade.
Right.
I think a great application for AI is account-based marketing. This is the targeting of the accounts within your sea of data and using predictive analytics or AI to target those. I mean, if you think about the average company, I don't know how many contacts Adobe has in its database, but it's got to be 10 million, 20 million, maybe more. And I know you don't have enough salespeople, even though you have a large sales team and channels, to address all those. And so because there's this explosion of data collection and a finite sales channel, we must refine that huge amount of data into the gems. And so I think account-based marketing is another great use of AI and predictive analytics to tell sales, these are the most likely buyers, and I think intent is a key part of that. You know, who's in market, because now much of the buyer's journey is done before they even register with you or come to you in your system, and there's often a committee involved. And so finding out who's actually searching for your competitors, who's searching for topics related to your key topics, is also a key use case.
So, you know, we have a big fire hose of what people buy online, and, you know, organizing that.
Can you describe actually what you guys do in a little detail, because I think it's interesting.
Satish, do you want to pull up that slide? I think that may be useful. So very quickly, we are able to observe what people buy online, so whatever they buy online in e-commerce. So given that, we are a very helpful tool for brand marketers like, you know, Procter & Gamble and Unilever and so on, so that they can figure out their market size, their market share, and so on. Or even if, you know, let's say if iPhone 8 were to launch, you know, they're very interested in understanding, am I stealing customers from Samsung? Am I upgrading customers? Which model is selling the most, and so on, and we are able to provide those type of insights. So a specific use case of machine learning in our case is, you know, if you see this, whatever the stick and ball chart there, so, you know, this is a representation of a couple of billion items in our database of what people buy online, right? So raw data is interesting, how do you organize it? So this, what you see here is done using unsupervised machine learning, and the clusters that you see there are buyer segments that tend to buy those brands together. So, you know, down at the bottom you see apparel and shoes. In the red I can't exactly see. I think it's telecom and electronics. Let me just go forward and this will make sense. I'm going to zoom into this yellow part. So it's apparel and shoes. Again, this is all automatically generated using machine learning because we are trying to figure out brand affinities. And the benefit of this is, you know, when John gets those $50,000 and he gets that credit card, I want to be there to sort of help him with what channel should he be investing in. So if he is at ZenSource, what are the other brands that customers tend to spend on, and where should he deploy those dollars? So if I go further, so here is a female buyer segment, people who buy on Neiman Marcus, and I can see the brands that are sort of nearby to Neiman Marcus based on what people actually buy. If I click further, here you can see I'm looking at Tiffany, which is a high-end brand. And here is a very non-obvious kind of insight that is possible using the machine learning techniques we use. So what you see is Tiffany buyers also buy from MLB.com, right? Not very obvious, but these are guys in the 35 to 55 age group who are buying presents for their girlfriends. And again, this is possible. We have billions of items that are in our database, and we can come up with insights like this by using these machine learning techniques, which sort of, again, bring out the shape in the data that we have.
Thanks for sharing that. So I think one takeaway, and I'm going to create some generalizations. I think in the B2C world, you're talking about brands. There's transactions, literally millions or hundreds of millions of transactions. It gives you guys a leg up. I think there's more advanced applicability. Ad tech is an example of that. It's individuals, it's humans interacting with advertising. I think the more you go into B2B use cases where it's accounts, like John and I, we're probably going after 10,000 accounts, right? Then it gets more. It's more probabilistic, right? We're looking for 80-20 directions. And I think it relates back to that user interface. I'll give you an example just to also share a use case myself. So what I'd love is, we're sponsoring trade shows. Say we do field marketing, right? You're doing a steak dinner for your best prospects. The kind of applications we're looking for is, tell the field marketer, tell them, hey, you're doing a Chicago, field marketing seminar on, storage. Maybe for executives. This person showed up in your pipeline. They're based in Chicago. They're an executive. They're stage 3. They look likely to be a good person to invite. That doesn't require machine learning. It could use machine learning. It could just use rules. But to make that marketer smarter would be really useful. That's a use case people have asked us for. And I think the pattern that I see there is, like Jessica, what you're describing, I think it's really fascinating because the sales rep has to call someone anyway, right? So when I was kind of joking about no one's going to die, I sort of meant that, right? I mean, you're going to pick up the phone and call someone anyway. If I tell you call these 10 people, you feel a little bit smarter, you're grateful, maybe, hopefully. Same thing with a field marketer, they have to invite someone. I think it gets harder when you tell someone don't do any steak dinners and fire that person who does steak dinners. Then you're like, oh shit, okay, now you're the CMO, do I really trust that recommendation? What's the confidence interval? It gets much harder, I think.
But can I just say, actually, I think if we're saying that, hey, nobody's going to die and machine learning doesn't have to be that accurate, I think what we're seeing is machine learning is actually saving lives, right? If you look at diagnostics and radiology reports and so on, I think machine learning systems are reading these reports better than the doctors are.
I agree, but not in our businesses.
I wouldn't cut us any slack here.
I don't know if it's necessarily that machine learning is not accurate. I think we still have a hump to go over in getting people to accept the predictions. That's at least what I'm seeing across my org, and when I was used to be selling predictive scoring, is that people are highly doubtful that the algorithm knows better than they know. That, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know how to be a sales rep. I don't trust the score, what it is. I want to dig in deeper. I want to see the data. I want to see the algorithm, even if they would have no idea what the algorithm actually was. I would think it's more about overcoming trust.
People love to one-up machines.
Yeah.
And they're going to try to find this one case where they were smarter than the machine.
Right. Well, it's supposed to be, it's probabilistic and it's directionally correct. Yeah. You're never going to be 100% correct all the time, but we can still trust the models to guide us. I kind of like to think of it as like a giant ship going across the Atlantic. It can guide us in the right direction, but yes, there will be outliers from time to time.
I think if you look at the entire machine learning literature in academia, especially from the computer science departments or what has happened in Silicon Valley, people use interchangeably machine learning and prediction, right? Now that's one part of machine learning. So what is important, especially in marketing? So to compare against something like image recognition, there is an image. Now, if you see a cat, if the algorithm recognizes it's a cat, that's great. Why did the algorithm think that it's a cat? Nobody cares. But in marketing, what happens is you are coming up with a recommendation. You also have to justify why you came up with that recommendation. And just solving the prediction side of the problem is not going to be good enough. So you have to solve the inference part of the problem, which is understand why you are recommending something, and if you take certain actions, what's the impact? So to your example, Nadim, like we have to run experiments to understand whether the steak dinner was worth it or not. So it's not that you're just feeding steak to one person. There are maybe 100 dinners planned, right? And what you do is now have a holdout sample where you don't actually offer steak to 30 of them. And to the other 70 that you do, then you understand the delta between the ones who are offered steak or not. So when we think about building these machine learning systems, we have to be very clear that predictions go together with experimentation. And there are different processes to set that up, whether it could be systems-based in case of B2C or more manual and process-driven in case of B2B, but you have to do that if you want to answer that well.
Right, and there's two observations. One is in the case of the cat, I haven't read the papers, but I think we know what is a cat and what isn't a cat.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, you can test whether that algorithm worked. So that's a different kind of prediction. Where there's a workflow, if you're telling someone, okay, invite Satish to the steak dinner, obviously you'll know later on, did they show up or not to the steak dinner? Did they get the invitation? But someone's not always going to log the decision. So it's a little bit, it gets murky. I think it makes it interesting. I don't know, John, if you're looking like you have a thought you want to share.
Well, I was just thinking I have a prediction based on this data. I'm not sure if a steak dinner is the best approach at a TiEcon audience.
Good one.
That's a good one.
Fair enough.
I think maybe a vegetarian option or something
He knows his audience.
might be the way to go, right?
There's always veg and non-veg options.
Yeah,
Don't worry.
so I don't know about the steak dinner, but I would go back to something that I heard in the previous panel from the woman from SAP, and she said, make it about the business. Don't make it about the technology. And so my advice to all of you young entrepreneurs out there, who I wish you great success here in this field of dreams called Silicon Valley, is don't make it about you, don't make it about your technology, but rather make it about solving the problem for your customers. And so similarly with AI, you know, people in marketing especially use what we call the shiny object. You know, it's the new trendy, fashionable thing that they're going to wave in front of you. And now it's AI. I mean, when I first started at Intel, the people in AI were these people that they locked up in a room that had body odor and they didn't let them out except once a month. And now it's very sexy, right? So I would go back to the basics of research. You know, I think alanturing.net is a great research asset for AI and the definitions of the various elements of AI. I'm sure that there are many resources in your own educational systems. I know many of you are IIT graduates and you have a very high all India ranking. And so I would encourage you to talk amongst yourselves about that. But again, it's really solving a business problem that will get you ahead in your career.
And maybe one point that Jessica made, so maybe I'll disagree a little bit so we can foster some. So you're saying, someone can push back on that, you're curating, these are the best accounts or best leads, and there's pushback, but the math is right. I think one of the challenges that we see in B2B is that someone can always say, yes, but your algorithm is based on the old data set. Our company is now different. We're selling we're growing. Most of you work for high growth companies. So unless it's, your company's going 5% a year, in which case you can't make that argument. But for most high growth companies, they can say, you know what, we've changed. And they're actually right. Like what we found is there's an element of when you're testing the data, to Harpy's point, the human feedback on does it look right is really critical, right? If it doesn't look right, it could be because the data is wrong. So there's a bit of an iteration there. So it's an art and a science, I think is what I'm observing. So with that said, we've got about 10 minutes, a lot of time for audience questions because this was such a popular topic. I haven't seen any questions in the app yet, so we'll just do, I think Satish has got a live mic, he's going to walk around, and I can't see anything, so you have to pay attention. Any hands? I see one over there.
Hi, I have a very specific question. Most of the discussion we had in this panel seem to be focused more on B2C sector, where you can run algorithms and you can typically do that. Some of it can be applied to B2B as well in terms of, narrowing down the accounts to some of them. But I have a more general, little bit of a vague question to see if you guys ever faced that problem and you've thought about it. Let's say you want to enter into the B2B space and you are going against an entrenched competitor. You are established brand yourself, you have been successful in one area, you want to enter into another area. And that particular area, there is another brand or another company which is very successfully entrenched, they have a whole ecosystem playing. Now you want to go against this competitor in B2B space, and that in B2B space also there are thousands of companies. How do you factor in your competitor's strength into your algorithmic mindset for narrowing down? What I'm trying to say is, has it been thought in the area of applying AI to marketing and machine learning about factoring in competitors' strengths while figuring out how to narrow down the accounts to focus upon? I know a little bit of a vague question, but I wanted to.
Yeah, so just maybe I'll recap it as, in B2B, has anyone taken into account the competitive dynamic and who you're competing with? Maybe we'll take one volunteer unless someone feels passionate.
I can take a shot at that. So if I think I understand the question correctly, it's how do you use AI, data, machine learning to maybe go into a new market, assess a new competitor. So at Mintigo, what we do is we do something called customer DNA. It's basically a digital DNA, just like you'd get from 23andMe. You send in a blood sample or a saliva swab, and they tell you you're Scottish or you're whatever you're French or whatever your background is. Well, Mintigo does that from a data perspective. We basically take in a few hundred data points who are your customers or your most advanced prospects, and then we go off and we crawl the web and we find the common attributes of your digital DNA. And so in this case, where perhaps you would have a new competitor, we would basically give you the DNA of your competitor. And so you're entering a new space, you need to see why people are buying from them. And then you can decide to enter some of those markets.
To add on to that, I would actually think to flip that question to the opposite. I think something you were mentioning earlier, like rather than going into the exercise with the question in hand, trying to find the data to validate your question, you can use predictive to demonstrate to you that perhaps you have a gap in your product line or in your delivery of your go-to-market strategy. This is something coming from FlipTop, where we wanted to build a product that would demonstrate to a company, yes, you think you should be selling to the enterprise in this area and this price point, but everything in our model is showing that you actually do a much better job at this price point, so perhaps you should be delivering something for the SMB. So maybe go away, build your SMB package, and then bring that to market. So just maybe flipping the idea on its head.
So one use case I've seen with BrightFunnel customers with attribution is they'll create a segment, they'll look at what's the next campaign action for an account or a group of accounts. And for that account, if it's tagged as a competitive opportunity, it'll recommend a different action. I'd say most people don't even have that data tracked, so I don't think it's a core use case, but I think it's a good question. I think we're going to see more innovation on that.
I think it's a strength of AI, actually, right? Because, the systems are all feedback-based. And as long as there's competitive response, it goes right back into the system. The system learns. So I think AI-based systems are actually going to outperform the competition in these cases.
Yeah, and I think this brings up a great point, Harpy and Jessica, is who are you going to trust for your decision making? Are you going to trust a salesperson who maybe had one or two-minute conversations on a cold call with someone, or what the data says? Well, I think actually you have to look at both, because you can't just rule out human intelligence and sort of the psychology in the field. But I think the data doesn't lie. I'll just give you an example. We had a customer that their East Coast sales rep said, we can never go sell into this one territory, especially we can never sell into an Amazon Web Services account. They had a competing product to Amazon Web Services. So we ran the models, we ran the predictive models with Mintigo. Guess what? The best cross-sell, upsell candidates were Amazon Web Services customers. Conventional wisdom was wrong. The human intelligence was wrong. It was probably 3 years, 5 years of some sales rep telling some sales rep, telling some manager, telling some VP, telling the head of sales that, no, we can't win against Amazon Web Services. But the data was actually showing something different. So they ran a whole campaign and they just crushed it. So that's the example of the data driving the decision-making process, as opposed to the other way around, the human.
And it would be even more powerful, right, to Harpy's point, if the AI looked at the data and the salesperson, this is maybe all of our dream, the salesperson was a robot, problem solved, right?
No, it's basically DeepMind, right? Go the game of Go, Lee Sedol versus DeepMind.
Exactly.
I mean, that's exactly what we're talking
Right.
about.
If we can build Go players, can't we build sales reps?
Right.
Someone here should start that company. I think every marketer would.
That's not a good news. I work for Amazon Web Services.
All right, let's take. I want to. There's a lot of questions. So.
I can help you with the
Actually, could we take just one question from the app because we are running out of time?
Okay. Well,
and we'll close it with that. Thank you.
Sure. My clock shows we got 5 minutes, but I'll stick to your recommendation. Sorry.
Good joke.
Let's see. I actually don't see questions in the app.
The question was, how accessible is AI for those with small budgets?
So how accessible is AI for those with small budgets? Interesting.
It depends on what you want to do, right? I mean, there are problems like, again, going back to the ad tech example, even if you have $50, you could be doing something interesting, right? Yeah. With the tools that Facebook and Google themselves provide for free, right? So I think it depends on the problem that you're solving for. I think the bar has been lowered to such an extent with all the cloud platforms and the frameworks available that somebody who has a basic degree of familiarity can get going. I'm not saying they can solve every problem under the sun, but you will do better than where you are.
Yeah, I think it's going to benefit, I do feel strongly about that. I think it's going to benefit everyone. Just the nature, like in our network, the data on all the marketing channels that everyone's producing is eventually going to benefit everyone else, just like in ad tech. And I think that's kind of the beauty of it, is the data ultimately wants to benefit everyone.
I think the AI talent and the data powering it is not as accessible. I think the bigger companies are hoarding it. But the algorithms, I think, are getting more freely available.
Right, so I read the question as benefiting from using a third-party solution. If you're building your own, I think you're right, then you need talent. But then there's a real barrier to entry for like a startup. If you're a startup, you have to amass the data. That's step one. And you should have started 5 years ago, basically, to amass the data before you can apply ML. So I think that's a real problem. But if you're a consumer of some of these tools, I think you can be any size. So a couple more. Let's see. Now I see the questions. Maybe let's take next to an audience a question. There's some repetition here, so maybe an audience question, just to make it interactive. There's a gentleman up here who's been eager. There's got to be some benefit to sitting in the front row, right?
Yes. Can you guys talk about if you guys are using AI and chatbots, and if you guys are, how is it working for you, and any third-party tools that you would recommend?
I'm really glad you asked this because that's one of the use cases that I'm eager to test out. We are trying to implement chatbots on our website. I wish I could tell you how it goes. I think we're turning it on next week. But that's something I'm very eager to try, is using chat on the website to try and interact with our customers and give them a better experience than just ignoring them completely. So no answer quite yet, but soon.
In our case, also something very similar. I mean, we have evaluated a bunch of frameworks. I think many of them are still a work in progress. We have our own internal initiatives. Even that is a work in progress. So I think it's early days. No recommendations per se.
Yeah, I'm involved with a chatbot company called Sudo.ai, and it's a chatbot that sits on top of Salesforce, and I think it's an extremely hard problem because I think they are very good if the problem is very narrow, if the vocabulary is very narrow, but I think there's probably more hype than what's being delivered right now.
The solution we're using is Drift, and currently it's a rules engine. So we've plotted out, I think, a couple 30 different messages and different permutations. I don't think there's really any AI behind it. It's more just a rules engine at this point.
I think if you generalize chatbot as a conversational UI, which they may or may not be the same thing, I think it's really interesting for analytics as well. You do have to ask the question of the data, so it's back to that. But I think it's a very interesting area, something worth thinking about. We're not doing yet.
Do you guys believe it's going to be big?
I want it to be, yeah.
I think the secular trend is data is exploding, right? And so the humans are getting overpowered by data. So to me, I can't see why wouldn't.
I mean, conversational bots like Alexa and Google Home are, I think, already proving that there's a lot of potential there.
I think it's a big trend you're pointing out with the chatbots because think about it. Do you really want to go to see a bank teller? No, you go to the ATM. Do you really want to go to the counter at the airline? Only if you're desperate. You really want to check in yourself. So even, do you really want to order your own coffee and see all those piercings and the dirty hair and all that stuff? you order it from your phone, right? So I think, you know, do you really want to talk to a salesperson or a BDR? I haven't had voicemail since 2001.
Yeah.
I put myself in, they call it the CMO Witness Protection Program. So no one can get to me. I'm sure you're all the same, right? So this type of, but people will engage with these bots. There's a company, I have no relationship with this company, but I heard it's cool. It's called Conversica. It's a virtual BDR. And they have very high engagement rates, and you know, maybe it's worth a try. So, because no one really wants to talk to a salesperson, but they'll talk to a robot. You know, named Sally.
There's a pattern here.
Yeah.
So there's a question here. Maybe I'll start with you. Oh, sorry.
Satish.
Oh, is it end or last question? All right. Now there's pressure for the last question. I think this is a good last question because it's about someone who's looking to do a startup, it sounds like. So how can B2B, and I'll ask you, Abhishek, how can a B2B startup get started with some basic ML tools? And if anyone else has ideas, you're welcome to chime in.
Sure. So I think in the B2B space, many times the size of the data isn't that much. So you can actually use even tools like R, right, to get started. What is more important to understand there is the class of problems are very different. I mean, they seem to be the same, but the data assets are very different. How you do entity resolution is very different. The kind of problems you're solving are different. The kind of message that you need to have associated with what problem you're solving is different. So I don't think the focus, if you're starting a startup, the focus should be the tool. I think the point that John was making, understand the domain, focus on the right problem. The tools are there, and especially for B2B, don't worry about the scale to start with, and if needed, you can figure it out at a later point.
Harpy, do you have anything to add? I think you might have a good perspective.
I think I would just say that I wouldn't get fixated on AI or not AI.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, you know, do I have a software engineer or do I not have a software engineer? I think it's going to be in everything. So to sort of make that sort of an insurmountable hurdle, I think it's kind of not practical.
You're going to need data. That's going to take a while. You're going to need domain expertise, which you may or may not have. That's going to take a while. And the ML stuff can only come after that. So on that note, I want you guys to give this panel a round of applause for spending a Saturday. Thank you guys.